Okay, well, I've got 2 o'clock, so we'll get started here. Hello, everybody. My name's Valerie Pope, excuse me, and I'm Deputy Director of the MRCA. I'm standing in for Morgan Arwood today, who's hopefully enjoying her spring break this week with her kids. Thanks for being here for part two of the Low Slope Safety Best Practices webinar. That's a mouthful. We're lucky to have Matt McCreary of Safety Resources Indianapolis with us again today for today's session. If anybody has any questions for Matt from last time, just unmute yourself and let him know. And Matt, you'll take questions kind of throughout, right? Say yes.
You're back. You're back now.
Was I out for a while?
It says my internet connection's unstable, so maybe it was me.
Oh, okay. Well, if you've got any questions for Matt, unmute yourself and ask the question, or put it in the chat, and I can chime in when we need to do that. So thanks, Matt, for being here and for spending another hour with us this week. And I will make you the host and hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Valerie. So I do recognize some similar names from last week. I also recognize maybe some new names. Hopefully those that are new were able to watch the first part of this, because it does kind of tie in. If not, it's not the end of the world. You can go back and watch that part one that lasted, exactly an hour to kind of review. So let me just get my screen going here. All right. So again, welcome. I'm gonna start with the same kind of disclaimers that I started with last week, which is I wish we were all together in a room somewhere where I could interact, we could tell stories, we could have a really good back and forth communication thing going on. That's how I like to do training. I prefer that. I'm sure a lot of you as safety directors also prefer that. This is a little different. Last week went reasonably well. I didn't have to wear my hard hat that day, so I had hair gel in and all that stuff. So I apologize about my dishevelment today. But I do encourage you all to ask questions and to have comments on the things that we're talking about. We had some really good feedback last week from a variety of folks on this session. And I thought it helped kind of move it along. Now, with that being said, I actually did not finish part one. So the first maybe 5 to 10 minutes is going to be actually finishing kind of some of my things that I had saved towards the end. What's nice about those last few things, it really ties into this best practices part two, which is where I kind of dive into some applicable interpretation letters, but also really more important, we dive into some OSHA docket case law. I'm going to disclaimer this, I am not an attorney, none of this is legal advice. However, I am a bit of a legal nerd, and I do kind of like the research of this type of thing, especially when I'm defending clients for either through the informal conference or sometimes through the administrative review process. I do enjoy this part of safety, which is probably some sickness that I have. But I'm not an attorney, so just want to disclaim that. So last, and everybody can see my PowerPoint. Yes. Okay. Last time we talked about, we had a bunch of different best practices, and I don't use PowerPoint like a lot of folks do. I try not to have a lot of text or words. We had a lot of pictures, and we had 22 slides that we got through, and it was like a discussion. Well, unfortunately for this week, or fortunately, however you guys prefer to learn, this week's a little bit more wordy when it comes to the PowerPoint itself. And there's going to be a little bit more reading here just because it's case law. I've tried to, I'm familiar with a lot of these cases from the past, but I also kind of re-familiarized myself in the past couple of days preparing for this presentation. So again, bear with me on that. Okay, enough of that. Let's actually get into it. All right, so where we left off last week was we were talking about best practices. And one of the coolest best practices that I've ever personally been involved with was an incentive program with a roofing company, or two roofing companies really, but there's one that really sticks out to me that kind of really worked for quite some time, but it did eventually have to go away, and I'll talk about that. But so as a best practice, having some type of incentive programs for your safety director or for whoever's doing safety audits, a consultant, a director, project manager, whatever that is, rewarding safe behaviors while still encouraging safety reporting is very important. Meaning you can't, obviously, it's illegal for you to have an incentive program that is based around injury numbers or accident numbers, because that would encourage underreporting, and therefore OSHA has made that illegal. And that's within the past 14, 15 years they've done that. The incentive program that I had in place that ran really well was based around actual observation. So if I were to go to a job site, I had a little handy little bag that had straps, book bag, whatever you want to call it, so I could climb ladders safely. And if the crew had 100% gold star, smiley face, I mean, all those things, 100% safe job site, which for roofers isn't necessarily always the case, we would put one red poker chip for every 5 guys. So one red poker chip and 4 white poker chips would go into that bag. It was non-translucent bag because people will try to game the system here. And so if we had a crew of 10, we'd have 2, or 2 out of 4. You can mix the numbers up, but we would shake that up. They would pull out the whoever pulled out the red chip would win a $25 gift card to gas stations or Walmart or Dick's Sporting Goods or Cabela's, whatever it is, $25 to $50. I think it started at 50. We ended up cutting it 25. It still was really effective. Guys got excited about it. And the best part about this incentive program was that when someone was maybe not wearing the appropriate PPE for acetone, or wasn't wearing their safety glasses when they're cutting, and the reason that those guys did not get to draw out of their gift cards, it was good natured, but people kind of got on those guys. It was kind of like a camaraderie thing that says, hey, come on, Bob, why didn't you have your safety glasses on when the safety guy, why didn't you have your safety glasses on? How about I just say that? Or why wasn't that ladder tied off or used correctly? Or why didn't you inspect your harness, fall protection equipment because there was damage? Whatever it was that we found that cost them that, you kind of heard this kind of back and forth that was interesting. And I thought that it improved safety. Now, this incentive program did grow stale after years of being used. And the reason it grew stale and the reason we had to mix it up at some point was, sorry, someone's not muted. Can everybody mute themselves, please? Awesome, thanks. The reason the incentive program started to grow stale is, number one, there was an expectation then now that they deserved, or they felt entitled to the rewards, which was a problem. Number two, and I'll admit this, I had been working with these guys for 3 years, and so I knew all these guys by first names. I mean, first name basis. I mean, me as the safety director for this roofing company knew everybody on the roof, and this was in my 20s. I mean, this is when I was first 4 or 5 years out, and I was actually part of the fail rate because I was letting them fix things rather than like marking them down for safety glasses. Well, like, okay, well, you had your safety glasses right there with you. Okay, I guess you can get your da-da-da-da-da. And I took onus of that when we went and reviewed the incentive program with the management team. However, if it's done right and if it's done consistently, these types of incentive programs that reward behaviors or reward safe practices, and again, not incident reporting, can absolutely be an effective tool and are certainly a best practice because OSHA obviously does not require an incentive program. So it's far from a requirement. Does anybody on here have an incentive program that they use and would like to share? No? Damn it. All right. More speaking, the better. Here we go. All right. So the other section was parapet walls. Now, parapet walls best practices. I had a slide after this that showed a parapet wall clamps, and we'll still get to that slide. But what's really interesting about parapet walls in roofing is that it's one of the most misunderstood section of the fall protection standard, in my opinion. I've actually written an article called The Parapet Wall Dilemma. This is way back 2009 about the misconceptions on that. And back at that time, there was an OSHA docket out there that said if the wall was at least 36 inches high and the width was at least 12 inches wide, so a total of 48 inches, that it met the requirements as defined by OSHA. What's really interesting about this case is that when I went back to research that, and again, I thought it was still a thing, and I'm really still don't really know where it went. I was unable to find that docket, but I was able to find some really interesting kind of case law studies that show that really what OSHA says, letter of the law, as far as what a guardrail or a parapet wall consists of, as far as height requirements, is what it is. Meaning OSHA says guardrails or any other fall protection uses guardrails need to be 42 inches from the foot level, plus or minus 3 inches, with a mid rail of 21 inches. Obviously, if you have a parapet wall, you don't have to have a mid rail, but that guardrail still has to meet that. Again, plus or minus 3 would be 39 inches in height. So, that's something that I found really interesting, because I think folks think even if we got 35 inch, I mean, there's really not much of a difference in safety factor, in my opinion, of course, now, but my opinion doesn't matter in this, between a 36-inch parapet wall and a 39-inch parapet wall. That 3 inches isn't a huge deal, and again, in my opinion. That being said, as far as when we're talking about OSHA requirements and what they can cite, you have to meet that 39-inch requirement. And so as a best practice, I would really encourage your estimating project management team, before you even go to the job site, if you think a parapet wall is going to meet the fall requirements, make sure that you actually pull out the tape measure and measure that system. So again, each of these dockets can be researched. They're public knowledge. You can, once this PowerPoint's shared, you can actually copy paste these numbers into your Google browser or whatever you use, and these case laws will pop up. But the first one revolves around a roofing contractor, or actually it was a masonry contractor on a roof, and where the compliance officer, and as they abbreviate it, CO, saw an employee in 2 areas where the edge had no parapet protection. In fact, he identified the edge where he saw employees as the near area to the material hopper, which clearly had parapet protection. The evidence plainly shows that HST's work did not require its employees to walk or work anywhere near the 2 unprotected areas. So the CO, the compliance officer for OSHA, cited this HST company for work in around a parapet wall that did not meet the compliance guidelines, but their work at the time was very much specifically in that area where the parapet wall was of appropriate height. As you all know, or most of you should know, on a lot of our buildings, the parapet walls can go all the way up to 48 inch. I mean, they can vary a ton of different sizes and dimensions throughout the same building. So I think that's an aesthetics things for the architect. But if I could ever get into architects' ears, I would always say design the parapet wall to meet that 39-inch height requirement. And that is after your roof system is installed. So you have to factor in how much TPO or buildup you have, obviously. But so the CO, so in fact, there was evidence that employees were kept 20 to 30 feet away from those areas. So again, this is a 15 16-page document, so I'm just trying to summarize this. But when they went, this HST company went to contest the citation, they won. So you can see the repeat citation item 1 is vacated. So the judge in this case found that HST's people were not exposed to a hazard and were trained to keep away from the areas that could be considered a hazard. So I think that's important to note, because again, one of our best practices from last time was a site-specific safety plan. Having that in place and making it detailed, it really goes a long way to ensuring that folks are meeting the requirements and protecting the company really from an OSHA citation and from obviously falls. Okay, so that was the first OSHA docket. The next one was Central Paving. These guys, really unrelated to roofing per se, but this specific case related to parapet walls. And they argued that a 24 to 25 inch tall wall was enough protection, just as much protection as a 39-inch wall, because it was 16 inches wide and was stepped up to approximately 38 inches for short runs along the south side of the deck, etc. They failed in this assertion. So again, the judge said, okay, order 1, citation 1, alleged 29 CFR 501B1, which is your fall protection standard, is affirmed and a penalty of $2,500 is assessed. So they went through all this whole process of hiring attorneys and everything else to really fight a kind of, almost in my opinion, an unwinnable case, trying to argue that a 24 to 25 inch tall wall is just as safe as a 39-inch tall wall. So I wanted to bring that to light. And then there is, what is the interpretation of a wall? Like, so another company, this is the bridge company. Central Paving was a paving company. This is Kokosing. I'm not sure I'm saying that right, but they claim that the bridge construction industry has always considered the bridge parapet wall, which ranges in height from 26 to 50, as fall protection and in compliance with OSHA. So what they did is they went back to industry kind of accepted practices and standards and tried to argue that this 26-inch to maybe use a 32-inch wall parapet wall met the compliance guidelines. And the judge, matter of factly, in his conclusion, I mean, there's a couple pages of just him kind of arguing or explaining his case, but I just took the highlight here. It said Kokosing's interpretation is rejected. Industry practice is not relevant where a standard such as 1926 501B1 prescribes employer conduct in specific terms and is not vague. So this right here, that particular line means a lot to me because it isn't vague. It does say that these walls need to be at least 39 inches in height. So a 37.5-inch wall, 38.5-inch wall could be citable. And so as a best practice, you guys need to have systems in place for parapet walls. It is a very, very common practice to say, we got a parapet wall, we don't need to set warning lines up. If you have a parapet wall that meets the requirements, but it kind of, like I said, tapers down or blocks off like a kind of like a castle turret, you need to make sure that your warning line systems are turning 90 degrees into that wall. So you're 6 foot away at all times. And really the best practice for that would be to have your warning lines offset from the compliant wall another 6 foot back. Meaning if you have a 24-foot wall section that is compliant, your warning lines would come into that 18 feet, 6 foot there, 6 foot on the other side, and you would tee into that just to make sure that your warning lines are always 6 foot away from a fall of greater than 6 foot or a leading edge or whatever you want to call that. So again, industry practice, what you've done for years, what other companies that you've worked for have done, what the MRCA says. I mean, all that really isn't relevant when it comes to this specific standard because the standard is very specific and it isn't vague. So that's why that docket was interesting to me. And then I just think it's interesting that people need to understand what burden the secretary of your state or your OSHA program, what their burden of proof is. And in order for them to establish a violation of an OSHA standard, they have to prove the cited standard applies, okay? The terms of the standard were violated, okay, we understand that. And then one or more employees had access to the cited conditions. So again, we go back to that first situation where they didn't have access or they were adequately trained to stay away from the actual physical hazard. You know, that's really one of our biggest kind of arguments when we're fighting cases or we're trying to get some penalties removed with our clients is we look at, was there actually any hazard associated with that? And we've been successful with that argument. And then number 4, the employer knew or with the exercise of reasonable diligence could have known of the violative condition. And we're going to talk about employee misconduct a little bit later here in this, don't want to call it a podcast, but webinar. And we'll talk about what exactly that is. But again, if you didn't have knowledge of the hazard and someone just decided to do something that was unsafe or in violation, you could likely get out of that standard. The issue is the employer, that definition, those first 2 words, the employer also correlates to your competent person on the job site. So if that person knew or should have known or was in the general vicinity of an issue, you're kind of in trouble there unless you have certain things met. That's a lot of information. Does anybody have any comments or questions on that specific? Those specific topics?
It doesn't look like there's anything in the chat either.
Okay, thank you. Because I don't have access I'm not looking at the chat. Well, dang, I missed my guys from last week. They were, okay. Anyways, I love you guys too. All right, here we go. Guardrail systems and clamps. This is an obvious best practice. This really works really well. It's a system that I've seen used time and time again to success. It extends the parapet wall. It allows the roofers to do their job without interfering. It takes out some of the guesswork with moving lines to 6 foot and back again. It removes some of the human error components of warning lines. And of course, we talked about safety monitors last week and how that is never a best practice and really should not be used. So guardrail systems and clamps, again, if you haven't explored these systems, they've called H brackets, they've been called a bunch of different things, but this is a system that I've seen used to success quite often on large construction projects or even smaller roofing construction projects for some of our roofers, just because it made sense. Your roofers can work right up to the edge, never have to worry about any additional fall protection systems if you're using these correctly and within OSHA compliance rules. Your other item would be, fall protection carts. We talked about this briefly last week, which is, if you see that rope, we talked about shear angles. These fall protection carts very much have a working angle, and it's very much identifiable on the cart itself. If you're not working within that safe working angle, you're not working safely, and you're in violation of OSHA compliance, and you're probably putting yourself at risk. This picture also shows kind of like a typical parapet wall, where it kind of varies, steps up, steps down. Again, I think that's designed for the beauty of it all, but you also see the warning lines are pushed closer than 6 feet. There's issues, but fall protection carts, obviously, by far the best mobile anchorage points that we can use for jobs where parapet walls kind of do go up and down in sizes. Okay. My picture's a little fuzzy there. I apologize. All right. So I thought I had another slide here. Not sure where it went. Oh, well. Okay. So when we're talking about worst case scenarios on a roof, we talked about skylights and we talked about bad decking last week. And I told a story, and we don't need to rehash that, but I do know a lot of stories that I've not been necessarily directly involved with, but I have heard of, that revolve around fatalities or serious injuries with bad decking, roofers falling through something that has been rotted or structurally compromised. And I wanted to talk about that. So the standard says, 501A2 says, before work begins, employers must ensure that any roof to be worked on has the strength and structural integrity to safely support workers. Sometimes it may be necessary to inspect a roof from the inside of the structure to identify integrity issues. That's what the standard says. What we're going to get into is we're going to get into some case law that kind of really highlights some maybe holes in your all safety program, and even, you know, some of the things that I've done, and say, okay, well, maybe we should take it one step further on some of these buildings, especially buildings that we're intimately familiar with, that we know that we have issues with. So like your maintenance contracts, you know, a lot of you commercial roofers, you love your maintenance contracts with these large manufacturing warehousing facilities. Well, some of these facilities are very old, and you may have some additional knowledge that needs to be passed on to the workers. And how do you do that? And how do you make sure that the decking is safe for people to work on, and for it to support the intended loads and all that? So this is a roofing contractor. You can look up the docket if you want to know who it is. I refer to them here as the company. They had a fatality on a job site where they were replacing concrete decks, deck panels, where the manufacturing facility maintenance people would look up and they would see damaged roof panels, and they would say, okay, they call this company would come out, they would drill holes on either side of the panel, they would slide 2x4s vertically down into that hole with the rope system. That 2x4 would then kind of toggle over to be horizontal, and then they would lift those panels, set them down, take metal decking, and repair these bad sections of roof. Which first off, I thought that toggle, that was pretty interesting. I've never seen that. I learned something while I was researching this. What happened was they had set this panel that they were replacing on the south side of the work area. Well, the south panel that they set the old panel on, or the damaged panel on, was also damaged and ended up collapsing, probably because of some additional weight. But the citation here, and again, I have a lot of information here on this one, but the citation here was upheld, just to spoil it for you all. And the company did receive a citation for the fatality, based on that they should have done a better job of the assessment. So the company argues that it did not know and could not have known that the roof panel could collapse. However, the violation here is the lack of assessment to determine the roof's structural integrity before the employees began work to damage the damaged panel. The standard requires the assessment of an employee's working surface prior to allowing an employee to work from that area, as evidenced by Mr. Keith's testimony. That was one of the other roofers on the job that was not killed, obviously. This was not an emergent problem. The damaged panel was scheduled to be replaced after the last ventilation unit was installed. Because Superior, that is not the company, that is the owner. Because Superior had previously identified the area of the damaged panel, the company knew the nature of the work to be done and its general location on the roof. Further, the company's foreman knew that Mr. Kuzi did only a visual appraisal of the underside of the roof from over 60 feet away. So their assertion was that they did an assessment of this bad decking from the factory floor 60 feet below the work area. And they could see some damage from the underside, but in order to locate that damage, they had to get onto the roof, and they were actually able to find the damage because of some pooling water in the general location where they identified this damaged panel. So again, 60 feet away, I understand why maybe the judge said, okay, that's not a good enough assessment. The company, through its foreman, knew the area immediately surrounding the damaged panel would be a walking working surface for its employees replacing the panel. Now, it did in this OSHA docket say that while they were replacing the panel and setting up the new stuff, that they were tied off 100% of the time. However, once the new panel was in place, that tie off came off because, again, this fall didn't occur through the actual opening of the hole. It occurred through the actual structural collapse of the adjacent panel. So the company knew the roof was over 50 years old. It had performed repairs and replaced other panels over many years. Furthermore, the company was familiar with this building and aware that the factory floor was over 60 feet below. The judge says a reasonable assessment at a minimum would require an examination of the underside of the roof at a distance much closer than 60 feet. Therefore, he concluded that the company knew it had not assessed the walking working surface for its structural integrity. So I've been on pre-construction walks for owners just like this, where we're looking at bad decking and we know that there's some of it out there, and we're looking from maybe not 60 feet, but 30, 40, 50 feet. This may be a case where, as a best practice, you take this one step further and you have some type of documentation process, checklist, whatever it may be, to actually document that the roof has been assessed in certain areas, that the bad decking has been determined exactly where and where not to work, or to walk without fall protection. Obviously, we have to go up to the roof and make those repairs. So if we have fall protection available to us, I mean, that, you know, and you were to fall through the deck, we would hope that that fall protection would be life-saving in that situation. But a form or some type of assessment form should probably be used on projects where bad decking is suspected. And that's the recommendation that I'm going to start making moving forward after kind of researching this more and more. There was another item here that I was going to talk about on this slide, but I'm spacing a little bit. Okay, actually it's right here. Sorry. Also, even if the company had not had a foreman on site who knew that an assessment for structural integrity was not done, it could have known this through the exercise of reasonable diligence. We talked about reasonable care last week. I'm not going to reiterate that, but as discussed above, this was a scheduled replacement of a damaged concrete roof panel. The company had a long work history at this factory, knew the age of the roof, and knew that an aerial lift or similar equipment was needed to adequately assess the roof's, and knew that an aerial lift was needed to adequately assess the roof structural stability. So what they're saying that the roofing company should have known that closer assessment should have been done in this area where the concrete deck failed. It also goes on to state the company was a roofing company and thus is aware its employees frequently use the surface of a roof as a walking working surface. The company generally asserts that it did an inspection of the roof prior to its employees' work to replace the damaged panel. The company does not explain how its cursory visual assessment qualifies as an appropriate inspection to determine the roof's structural integrity as a walking working surface. So if you have documented something, that's what I was going to say on the previous slide. This does not necessarily have to be an engineered, you don't have to get a structural engineer to actually determine the structural integrity of the roof. But you do need to make sure that it's not just a cursory inspection, a visual inspection that says, okay, hey, there's bad deck, you know, go for it. When we're assessing these types of situations, we really need to make sure that there is some system in place. Pictures probably would go a long way, a narrative, some type of write-up, and then making sure that your foreman and your crew is aware of the issues on the roof. So keep that in mind. Maybe that's something that you guys can take out of this and become a best practice, and you know, maybe that saves a life 10 years down the road or whatever. I do think it's important.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat. Can you see it or do you want me to read it?
I cannot see it because I'm minimized. If you could read it.
Yep. Dennis has a project now in bidding with comprised decking, rusted and damaged over acid tanks, confined space area below. Oh, it's a confined space area below the area where it's whatever.
Right.
Is fall protection and initial assessment enough?
Wow. That's like, that is some Batman stuff, like falling into the vats of acid. Okay, so we know it's rusted. We know the decking's bad because that's why it's being replaced. So I literally just got done saying that an engineer is probably not required on some of this stuff, but that one's so unique. I would, if I'm the safety director for that company, I'm probably taking one additional step and asking the owner, especially for in bid stage, of what the live loads are for that roof in its current condition. Or yeah, the live loads or the snow loading, whatever, however when you look at that. Because obviously we got to put material up there, we got to put people up there, and we got rusted deck above acid pits. Yeah, let's just say we need more information for sure, Dennis. I think due diligence. I think again, if you're sitting in front of a judge and you're trying to argue because you had a fatality on this, that you did everything you could possibly do to ascertain the structural integrity of the roof, I think that you need to take it one step further and ask for at least some type of like information from the owner. So if it's still in bid stage, that would be something that I would ask as part of the RFP process or RFQ process. I hope that answered the question. That's a tricky one, but we know it's rusted and we know that there's a corrosive underneath. So to me, I'm not even really that comfortable getting on the roof to assess it, but again, I don't know exactly what the gauge of the corrugated steel deck is and all this other stuff. I don't know how often people are up there, et cetera, but there is a reason that they're replacing the roof, and it's probably because it's not structurally sound anymore. So hope that answered the question. So that's a really good question. And Dennis, if you want to talk offline about that, I'd be happy to kind of discuss that because it's interesting to me. But the company's only evidence of a pre-work assessment was a cursory visual inspection to determine if there were any pipes or other obstructions attached to the panel. So they didn't want to go through the actual, they look at the underneath side to make sure that they're not going to cut through electrical conduit or, worst case scenario, maybe like a PSM factory where you have like chlorine or something like that. But as demonstrated through the compliance officer's inspection, Superior could make an aerial lift available to conduct a closer assessment. So again, you had the ability to do that on this case. Now, do you have the ability to do that in a confined space, acid container? I'm not sure you do, without some serious PPE. So I would really put that back onto the owner or the engineer that's bidding the work or the architect, whoever's your prime. I would put that back on them and ask the question. So the company asserts that its training includes the inspection of a roof's underside. Oh, I see where my chat is now. He said, thanks. You're welcome. The company asserts that its training includes the inspection of roof's underside. However, it provided no evidence regarding how it trains its employees to assess the roof as a walking working surface. So this was interesting. And I know that Gary had talked the previous 2 sessions about training and best practices. I didn't listen to all 2 hours of that. So if he talked about training on assessing structural integrity for your crews, sorry for double dipping, but this is something that honestly, we probably should be doing more of. We probably should be training people on how to recognize bad decking. What are the processes? What are the steps? Having them fill out something, whatever. And then the judge kind of wraps this up with like, case law is clear. An employer cannot relinquish its responsibility for employee safety. And if an employer neither creates nor controls the hazardous condition at a multi-employer work site, it may defend against a citation by showing that it protects its employees by taking reasonable alternative measures or that it could not have reasonably known of the hazardous condition. Again, in Dennis's situation, that would go out the window because they have disclosed that they have acid pits, there's corrosion, etc. So we know that we have a hazardous condition. So now we have to take reasonable measures or reasonable care over that. The company's own expert, this is a 30-page case, by the way. So these are just highlights. The company's own expert acknowledged that using an aerial lift to get closer to look at the roof's underside is better than a visual assessment from over 60 feet away, obviously. But that made this case because it was their own expert that kind of threw them under the bus in this particular situation. And he said, you may not be able to catch everything from the ground. And that's this, line 13, that's the deposition stuff. So the judge found that the company did not take reasonable actions to assess the structural integrity. They did not conduct a proper assessment either before they started the work or to remove the damaged panel or when the damage to the adjacent panel was revealed. that's something that I didn't actually put in here, but when they removed the actual damaged panel that they thought was damaged, they noticed the panel to the south had some exposed rebar and was starting to flake away. So at that point, maybe a further assessment should have happened on this, but that's actually the panel that ended up failing and causing this fatality. So, so he concludes the terms of the standard were violated. Again, this is a really interesting case to me. I highly encourage, honestly, if you're a safety director or even if you're just kind of interested in this kind of stuff, to read that case. It shines some lights on things that, you know, I've been doing safety for 15 years now, and it kind of reminded me like, oh, hey, like, I understand that we need to train roofers on fall protection, ladder, scaffold, HAZCOM, OSHA, fire protection. I understand what we need to train roofers on, you know, specific equipment, you know, like, you know, the different D-ring anchors, like we talked on the part one, the roof carts, the parapet walk. We need to train all that. Now, that's kind of obvious, but then I'm thinking to myself, man, I've never trained on how to recognize structural integrity, but maybe I'm not qualified to do that. Maybe we do need a structural engineer or someone that's maybe been in the business longer than I have, or that understands roof systems better than I do to train on that. That's an interesting kind of topic. And I think, honestly, the roofers that you have on staff probably would be pretty engaged with that topic because they've never heard it before. So, again, I would encourage you guys to look up that docket. Really, really interesting case. Any questions on that? All right. So, I also just wanted to mention this because I think this is misunderstood. I think a lot of the roofers here probably don't do this, but again, I want to make sure that, like, I see this a lot with demolition, honestly. So whenever you have materials, if you're removing a roof system and you're 18 feet, you can throw that roof system directly into the dumpster or the hopper or whatever you're using for that. But if you're over 20 feet, OSHA requires that you have to have some type of enclosed chute or equivalent material, or sorry, enclosed chute of wood or equivalent material. And then they kind of go and define that. But you actually have to have a dump chute for anything over 20 feet. And I just wanted to make mention of that because I think that's commonly violated in different trades, maybe not so much as roofers, but wanted to mention that. Okay. I wanted to talk about the first man up rule and how everybody has a different opinion on it, including OSHA, including people in OSHA. You know, you talk to OSHA guy A and OSHA gal B, and they're going to have probably a difference of opinion on what this is and how it can be implemented safely without violation. And you may talk to Matt McCreary with Safety Resources, and you could talk to Chris Hall with Safety Resources, who's also been here for 15 years, and we've been working together for 15 years, and we probably would have different interpretations on this. So I'm kind of going to go with my interpretation of it because it's not an OSHA standard per se. It's a gray area. The chicken or the egg. So what comes first in order to set fall protection? I argue that the egg has to, or well, I'm not even going to use, I argue that the warning lines have to come first before we can establish the rest of the fall protection systems, or our fall protection cart has to be set first with somebody actually up there to receive the material, unhook, et cetera, to before we can actually have active fall protection. So what I always encourage my clients to do is I encourage them to set their fall protection system before any other work begins. So if you go ahead and establish your warning line system or establish your tie-off points before any other work begins, I think that you are meeting the spirit of the first man up rule. So this is an important exemption that every roofer should be aware of, and I'm sure you are actually, but you are allowed to be up on a roof inspecting prior to and after the work's complete without any additional fall protection. You do not have to have fall protection as long as you are inspecting. So that is inspecting, investigating, and assessing workplace conditions before the actual work begins or after work has been completed. As soon as one of your people pick up a tool and start doing any type of activity that's considered roofing work, then you now have to meet the compliant guidelines of 1926.501. Since they are most likely to be able to accomplish their work without going near the danger zone, requiring the installation of fall protection systems under such circumstances would expose the employee who installs those systems to falling hazards for a longer time than the person performing the inspection or a similar work. Let's say I have to, let's just use the parapet wall example. I have to go and measure a parapet wall for a flashing or coping that's going on there. And it's a 16-inch parapet wall. I know it's not fall protection, but for me, in order to go ahead and establish a fall protection point and then tie off, and then I have to come back and repatch it if I don't, well, all this stuff just to take one simple measurement, they exempt you for that. So again, if you're investigating and assessing workplace conditions before and after, then there is an exemption there. If you're not familiar with that, it's definitely something that you should be familiar with, but it's also something that you should train on. You should train your estimators as much as your roofers, because they're exposing themselves just as much on these types of things. So they should be trained on this exemption, and it should be documented. Actually, this could be a really easy toolbox talk for your estimators, just to kind of up the ante on some training documentation. Any questions on that? All right. All right, the first man up rule is the employer's designated, trained, and suitably equipped qualified person assigned to access an elevated workplace more than 6 feet above a lower level for the sole purpose of installing a personal fall arrest system to protect those workers that follows. Similarly, the last man down is the designated person to pull up that last anchor and to patch that last hole in the roof if we were using penetrating anchors. While the first man up anchors are sometimes deemed infeasible, some safety professionals contend that OSHA regulations actually exempt the first man up, last man down from compliance for about 15 minutes for making an inspection, investigation, or assessment of the workplace conditions. So I fall within that some safety professionals. I would contend that the last man down or the first man up is exempt from fall protection rules. Now, have I challenged that through administrative law? No, I have not had the pleasure of going through a contest case for that particular situation, nor do I really want to. But I don't know how you do it otherwise, the chicken or the egg argument, what comes first. So wanted to bring that up, thought it was interesting, and feel like it's something good to pass on to other safety people. These last few slides are just slides that I want to make sure that we're aware of. For employee misconduct, we know we have to have 4 legs to that table. We have to have training. We have to have they weren't observed by the competent person. There's this. I can't do that. We have to show that the company's conduct went well past the established company policy. And then we also have to show, which is not actually on this slide, we have to show that we have previous disciplinary action for our folks. Meaning if I did a safety audit 2 months ago, 2 years ago, 2 weeks ago, 2 days ago, whatever it is, and I found someone that was similarly in violation for what OSHA found them in, let's say we're outside of a warning line without fall protection, or too much slack in the rope grab systems, we have to show that our company safety program has teeth. And so the only way we can do that is documentation. And the only way that the documentation really works is in the form of a written warning that actually has some issue, some disciplinary action. So maybe it's retraining. Maybe you have to sit down with the president of the company and explain to them why you were violating safety issues. Maybe it's if you get your second one, you're terminated or you're suspended for a week without pay. Maybe there's a whole variety of things. If you're a union, maybe you have to follow within their disciplinary action procedures, but you get the point. There has to be some type of teeth to, if you're sitting there right here now today and you don't have disciplinary action write-ups for someone in your company within the past year, you need to evaluate how you're doing that, and you need to start looking at getting out on job sites, doing unannounced random site safety audits, and writing individuals up for violations that you see. I'm not saying you need to fire your folks. I'm not saying you need to run them off. I really don't want you to do that. That's only for extreme cases or for extreme stupidity. But If you don't have that, you want to have the ability, because I know for the most part, all of you are probably doing the training, toolbox talks, annual training, quarterly training, monthly training. I know that you probably have a company safety manual that has programs and policies, so established work rules. I know you guys have competent people that sometimes aren't always on the roof or in the general work area when OSHA shows up, so we can get out from underneath that if possible. But where people always fall down, companies always fall down, is they don't have those written warnings, and we really need to have that in place. This is by far the most common defense that I use when I'm going through an OSHA informal conference. Luckily, here in the state of Indiana, against the former director retired, so I had a really good relationship with him, although it was a 3-hour-long informal conference every time. We were able to discuss these things. Some states, especially Fed states, you may actually have to take this to contest in order to claim employee misconduct. And if you have those things in place, though, you have a high likelihood of succeeding with this defense. The impossibility of compliance defense for the roofing trade. This defense may be used in a situation where the roofers are working on a gypsum deck or domed roof. This scenario would not allow for conventional means due to the gypsum strength and the anchorage available to roofing contractors. So you would have to come up with something that maybe is outside the box that also creates a same or similar level of protection for your workers. That was honestly off the top of my head. I'm not sure if that's the best example of impossibility of compliance for roofers, but this is an example. Anytime you're going to do impossibility of compliance, you need to have a site-specific safety plan. That site-specific safety plan needs to be specific, number one, obviously, and then it needs to be trained. Your workers on site need to be trained on it, not just your competent person, but everybody else that's working there or exposed to these fall hazards. And remember, in order to use this defense, you must be able to prove that compliance with the standard was functionally impossible or would preclude the performance of required work. And then the last one is no employer had no exposure or equipment was not in use defense. So again, sometimes OSHA tries to cite my contractors or our contractors, however you want to look at that, for tools that weren't in use, or scaffolding that wasn't in use, or ladders, blah, blah, blah. If it's not in use and there's no exposure to actual any physical person, then they can't cite you on that. Now, again, going back to my best practices number one, which was never argue with the OSHA inspector while the OSHA inspection's ongoing, because they'll find other stuff. Remember that, because you're not going to want to make this defense until you're actually sitting in front of the area director during your informal conference or during your administrative review, because you don't want to rile them up, because they'll find something, they'll find a ground pin pull, whatever, they'll nitpick. But if you have a red tag on your scaffolding and no one's on there and it says keep off, that's communication that the scaffold's not to be used. Therefore, you can argue, even if the scaffold had damage or there was unsafe planking or the gravity pins weren't working or the pigtails weren't in, uplift pins, whatever you want to call those, you can argue that there was no exposure. And most OSHA inspectors should know that that's the case. But again, I've had many of experiences where they may not have, at least some of the people that I've worked with in the past from that administration. Okay. Just really, I know, again, Gary talked about training, but this just popped in my head at the very end. Make sure we're training folks on, especially if you're doing remodels, your people need to have the 2-hour asbestos, 2-hour lead, aerial lift, forklift certifications need to be done within every 3 years. The aerial lift certification standards changed recently. Make sure you're looking into that. The ANSI MEWP, MEWP standard, you need to look into that. There's just some slight changes, but it is enough to kind of throw us for a ride a little bit on how we can't necessarily train status quo anymore. We have to change a little bit how we do. Mostly revolves around familiarization of the lift and how do we do that and how do we document that. And then we're getting, it's a 70-degree day here in Indianapolis. It's beautiful. It's a little windy, but we're coming into the summer. I just want to remind you all, best practice, make sure that all of your employees, if nothing else, get a toolbox talk on what are the symptoms of heat-related illnesses. This is really, if we're talking about what actually hurts our people the most often, for roofers, it's this. This is important, and I wanted to just kind of throw it in there before we wrapped up because it can lead to death, but it can mess people up, is all I'm saying. And you guys know that, but make sure you're training on it, make sure it's documented. On best practices part 1, we talked about the carbon monoxide poisoning deal. Remember, make sure your people are trained to not have any of that stuff indoors. I know sometimes we're working on roofs that have some like indoor components. Make sure we're not using gas powered equipment on there. And then of course heat also is a factor. All right, 4 minutes early this time. I was 4 minutes late last, so giving you guys all of your time back here. Are there any questions or comments on this presentation?
There is nothing in the chat yet. We'll give it a second, but also you guys can just unmute yourself too and chime in. Feel free to sing it out.
I'm telling you, virtual stuff, I'm having a really hard time getting engagement.
Yeah, it is tricky, but we're on the home stretch, right?
Right, I know.
That's what I keep telling everybody anyway. I'm just going to keep saying it until it happens.
Exactly. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this. When I committed to this back in October, of course, things were a little slow, and now we're in the middle of March. Weather's getting nice, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I have to prep for this. But it ended up working out, and I honestly can't believe I talked for an hour today. But I did, so here we are.
Matt, Mark McGuire, got a question for you.
Hi, Mark.
Hello. So, as you know, with our company and a lot of the companies, the service departments are a pretty strong component of the company, and sometimes hardest to corral when it comes to safety. Do the service guys, and this was based on one of Gary's earlier conversations in the training, but do they fall under 1910 if they're doing repairs on roofs instead of 1926?
Probably. Maintenance, so repairing holes, patches. But I mean, if you're doing decking, I think you're back in the 1926. I don't think it really makes much of a difference, because 1910 is 4 foot, 1926 is 6 foot. So I'm assuming you're going to be doing the same things. The problem with the maintenance, there's a lot of problems with the maintenance. You can't go up there and, in order to patch a roof hole, set another penetrating anchor adjacent to it. So now you have 2 holes to patch. And so I've talked about this quite a bit, and we can, that is a challenge. But what was the issue with the 1910? Why would 1910 be better or worse for you, Mark?
Well, I think it was worse because I think that took the monitor option out off the table.
That's true.
The flagging and monitoring.
Okay, yeah, that's true actually, because 1926 allows. We could argue that there's a lot of feasibility issues with that. If we have a maintenance patch in the middle of the roof, now if we're on the perimeter of the roof, I think we got to go ahead and fall protection. But I think there's a feasibility issue, Mark. I think we fall back onto some type of site-specific safety plan, even if it's just a template. A one pager where they check off that they've done these things, that they understand that they're not supposed to go within a certain distance from the roof. And then you just come use that as an orientation. I think that goes a long way based on that, like first OSHA docket, like the judge said, like, listen, these guys knew that they weren't supposed to go that 20-foot distance to where that parapet, even though there was no warning lines or whatever else in place, they knew it. They had the documentation to prove it. And so something like that for the maintenance crews may go a long way.
Okay, that's a great idea. All right, thanks, Matt.
No problem.
Any other questions? All right, well, thanks, Matt, for a great session. If anyone does have questions, you can also email Morgan, and she'll get back to you with an answer, and we can coordinate that with Matt or Gary or whomever. Our next meeting will be Tuesday, April 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central. The topic will be steep slope safety for your employees and the safety relationship with subcontractors. That sounds scary. So the speaker will be Gary Allman of Allman, Mahan and Furry. I'm sure everybody's familiar with Gary, so it probably will be scary. They call him like the Prince of Darkness or something. The board does. So, but you have to be here. It'll be a good one. That's like a cliffhanger promo or whatever for you for next time. Okay, that's it for today. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you back here April 20th.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.